Welcome to Revelation Session 6. This is our sixth week in this magnificent closing book of the canon. Sometimes you may hear that Revelation should be read with the Revelation open in one hand and a newspaper open in the other. But really, Revelation, and truly with any book of the Bible, you should have not so much the newspaper open in the other hand, but maybe the Old Testament. So have Revelation open in one hand and the Old Testament open in the other. To look at Revelation through the lens of current events is to, in essence, get sucked into an interpretive rabbit hole. Let me illustrate this way. So if you're reading the book of Revelation in 1967, you could read it through the lens of the Arab-Israeli conflict of that year. And everything you read in Revelation, you see that conflict. A few years later, say 1973, you read in Revelation, you've got a newspaper open in the other hand, and you're reading Revelation and you see in it the scenes from the Yom Kippur War of 1973. We could fast forward a few years after that, you read Revelation and you see in it references to the hostage crisis in Iran. And then in 1990 and 91, and you see in the pages of Revelation that war being played out. And then another 10 or 12 years after that, and you see the Second Gulf War being played out in Revelation. And currently, if you read Revelation through the lens of current events, what do you see? You see on the pages of Revelation scenes from the current war in Gaza, the Israelis fighting Hamas. So what we need to do is to, as it were, escape from this interpretive rabbit hole. How do we avoid that? The first thing is we need to really think about what it says to its original hearers. What does this book mean to its original hearers? How would they have read it? First thing is this. The book of Revelation contains no direct quotes from the Old Testament. There are no direct quotes from it, but some 70% of the verses contain at least one reference to the Old Testament. So we could think of it this way, that the whole book is saturated, is soaked in allusions and references to the Old Testament, but the writer is so well versed that he doesn't even need to quote them. He doesn't need to look them up. He just knows them. Two things I think that should be noted here. Just how thoroughly John knew the Old Testament scriptures. He knew them backwards and forwards, apparently, and never needed to bother to look anything up. He just knew them. And the second thing is these are divinely inspired visions. These aren't visions that John comes up with in his own imagination. These are divinely inspired visions. And so God is giving these visions, and they are intended to be things that the people who read them would understand. The Spirit is communicating to these people in images that they would recognize. We've already seen that numbers have meaning. Numbers mean things. So when you read the Revelation, you've probably already noted that Revelation is centered around 3 sets of 7. The number 3 is very important. The number 7 is important. There are 7 seals. The 7th seal is another series of 7 trumpets. And the 7th trumpet is yet another series of 7s, 7 bowls. In Revelation 8, we're introduced to the trumpet judgments. And if we're going to see Revelation, if we're going to read it the way John's first readers or hearers would have heard it, let's think Old Testament. Let's think Old Testament. The Old Testament are their scriptures. So in Revelation 8, I think we have a great test case on how to read this and interpret. So in that chapter we see water that is turned into blood, there are locusts, there is fire cast on the earth, the daylight turns dark. So thinking of those elements, water is turned to blood, there are locusts and fire on the earth, the daylight turns dark. If you're thinking Old Testament, what comes to mind? If you're really familiar with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Scriptures, you would, that's the Exodus. That's the plagues on Egypt from the Exodus. And that would be exactly right. That would be exactly right. The judgments in the 8th chapter, the trumpet judgments, are a reference back to the plague on Egypt. Now, if you to look back at the Exodus, there were 10 plagues on Egypt, and they were in order. The Nile rivers turned to blood. And then came a plague of frogs, and then gnats, then flies, death of the Egyptian livestock, then boils on their skin, fiery hail, locusts. The day is turned to night, so there's darkness across the land, and then death of the firstborn. Those are the 10 plagues on Egypt that Moses announced. So John's readers, his hearers, they read this chapter, these trumpet judgments, and they would be thinking about, they couldn't help but be thinking about those plagues on Egypt. And I think this would be instructive for them in at least 2 ways. First, each of these plagues can be seen as a judgment of or a defeat of an Egyptian god or goddess, as the case may be. The Nile River was a god. So the Nile River being turned to blood is a condemnation and a defeat of the river god. There was a goddess of birth named Hecate who had a frog's head. So obviously the plague of frogs is a defeat of that goddess. The desert god of storms was named Set. And the plague of gnats was a defeat of this desert god of storms. The god you watch it was represented by a fly. So going forward, the death of the livestock was a judgment of Hathor, a goddess with a cow's head, and Apis, the bull god of fertility. The plague of boils is a defeat of Sekhmet, a goddess over disease, and Isis, the goddess of healing. Plague of locusts was a defeat of Nut, the sky god, and Osiris, the god of crops. Darkness on the land was judgment and defeat of Re and Horus, both of whom were sun gods for the ancient Egyptians. The death of the firstborn was again judgment or defeat of Hecate, and Men, the god of reproduction. So the point is that God, Yahweh, is supreme over all the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, up to and including a human ruler who claimed to be a god. The second point, and it is equally as important, what was the point of the plagues? What was the point of the plagues? Why did God send them? These plagues were a means of judgment and deliverance. The plagues of Egypt were a means of judgment and deliverance. They were a reminder to be faithful. So the first century Christians who read this or hear it they would think of it through the lens of the Exodus. And the reminder of these judgments in the book of Exodus, that the Israelites are to be faithful, to be reminded that their God reigns over all. Yahweh is in control of all of these events. Yahweh, the Lord, is sovereign. Whether the ancient plagues or the trumpet judgments of Revelation, the point is that their God reigns. Their God is sovereign. And is sovereign over an ancient Pharaoh who claimed to be a god, and sovereign over a Roman emperor who demanded to be worshipped as a god. The call is for them to be faithful. The call is for them to believe, to have faith. I hope you enjoy your discussion.